Hello folks, my name is Richard Ash. I'm the Director of Parks and Recreation for the City of St. Charles, Missouri. And today I have the pleasure of introducing to you one of my true friends and colleagues in the profession, and actually a true legend in the wonderful work that we do. Let me introduce to you Mr. David Fisher, who is the Executive Director of the Great Rivers Greenway District in the St. Louis metropolitan area. David, please say hello to the folks, if
Thank
you will.
you, and hello. I'm delighted to be here today, and really quite honored at this opportunity.
Well, it is quite an honor, and I'm sure we're going to find out a lot about you today, why you are what you are. But as we begin our dialogue today, let's talk a little bit about your personal life, if you will, but your personal being, so that we can kind of set a baseline about who you are, what makes you tick, those kind of things. So if you can, why don't you give us a little insight into, your early life, your youth, your family, your education as you move through, and some of your hobbies and some of the passions that make you what you really are.
I was born in Oklahoma, sort of raised on the Coronado State Plains of the Chihuahuan Desert of West Texas, where I really became really enthralled and delighted with desert life. I just thought that the desert offered everything in the world that a person would need. And went through 12 years of high school and then went off to school at Texas Tech, when I found out that there really were trees that were bigger than 10 feet tall. So you do kind of expand your horizons a little bit. Went through Texas Tech, was drafted into the U.S. Army, and from the U.S. Army, spent a couple of years in active service, got out, started my first job in Winnetka, Illinois. In the 60s, when I got out of the Army, there was just a huge opportunity for folks of my profession. I think that by the time I got out of the Army in 1968, I think I had about 30 job offers. So you really could pick and choose as you walked your way. So I'm from Maryland, from the Pentagon where I worked, all the way back to West Texas. I stopped at about 14 different locations. And everywhere along the way, I said, this is a different opportunity than I'd ever had hoped that I would ever have. I got back to Texas to my father's house, and I said, the job that intrigues me most is the one in Chicago. So I went to Winnetka, Illinois, as the director of planning in Winnetka, Illinois. And from there, started my professional career. Personally, I have two children, two lovely children, a wonderful wife who is also my soulmate and has been for a very, very long time. My passion is deserts. It really is. I love deserts, and I go because I read deserts, and that was one of the early things in my life, is that I learned how to read the desert. I spoke the language of the desert. My father taught me that as one of my real heroes.
Okay. Well, you talked about, let's go back to your education a little bit and focus. When you said you went to Texas Tech, well, what did you study?
Oh, I started out as a mathematics major. And then I switched to physics. And then as I was wandering around the halls of indecision in my junior year, I was over into the Department of Landscape Architecture and Park Administration and became fascinated back. It felt like that was where my soul was. And so I changed schools back into the Department of Landscape Architecture and Park Administration, and went the next 3 years there.
Okay. Staying on your personal life a little bit, and one of the things you didn't tell me in the initial question there was about your hobbies. But let me ask you even a little bit more pointed, because I know a lot of us have lots of hobbies and things we like to do, but sometimes we really never seem to get around to doing them as often as we would. But what are your true leisure pursuits? What do you do in your off time when you're not working? And tell me how it nourishes you. Tell me how it renews you.
Well, I read a lot. I read several novels a month, perhaps, technical journals. I read probably in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 hours a day. And that's off and on during the day, sometimes at lunch, sometimes on the job, sometimes in the evening. I do not watch television, unless it's some documentary or some debate I would like to see. My real love is working with the earth, I love to garden. I don't have an opportunity to do that much. I had a collection of daylilies in Minnesota when I lived there that were next to none, and I worked that, and it was really nourishing. And a really passion too is woodworking. My father was a cabinet maker, and I like to think that I've inherited a lot of those skills, and I love to do that kind of stuff. It relieves me. I am a recluse by nature. I discharge around people, and I gain my energy when I'm by myself doing the things that I like to do.
Okay, that's interesting. Mainly because coming from the school that you did and knowing that some of the things that you did, I would have figured it'd be more of the cycling and, you know, some of the other things about you. Say sometimes you don't really know people as well as you think.
Right.
Well, you mentioned about how you wandered around the halls at school and then got into the, you know, the School of Landscape Architecture and Parks and Rec there at Texas Tech. But what really inspired you or triggered you to take that direction?
There was a gentleman by the name of Elo Jorbanowski, who was the head of the Department of Park Administration Landscape Architects in Texas Tech, and I was wandering through the halls actually of their building, which was a standalone building, and bumped into him. And in his sort of very affrontative way, he said, "What are you doing here?" And I says, "I'm trying to figure out where I want to go, what I want to do. I've been to Tech for a couple of years. I've got all of my science degrees, or all of my science classes behind me. I'm looking for some electives. Now what am I supposed to do?" And I was intrigued by coming over here. So he pulled me in his office and he started recruiting me. It was interesting. He recruited me. He sort of said, "You know, we need people who have a strong background in the sciences. We really want people who really want to have this profession." And after a period of, about 15 minutes, he had me totally convinced that this was my career track. And so I switched schools the next semester and walked into one of his first classes. And one of the most profound things that the man ever said to me he said, "As you get through school here, and once you get through school here, you will have all the skills to know how to do something." He says, "But if there's one thing that I want to instill in you more than anything, it's not the people that will always know how will always have a job, but the people who know why will always be their boss. I want you to know why when you walk out of this school, what you're doing."
That's interesting. Let's take it from school now and up until what you are today, the profession I mentioned earlier, what your title was officially, but not actually what you're doing. But if you will, can you move through, once you left school, your first job out there in the Chicago area, and then taking us through in your career track, what jobs did you do? And
as I said earlier, my first job was Director of Planning and Operations in Winnetka, Illinois, which was an independent district on the North Shore of Chicago, a wealthy little district, and they were paying what I thought at that time was huge money. And so I moved to Chicago area and took the job, and it was really interesting. It's because I was sort of thrust into a situation as the only professional in the planning operations field in this district. And so I would go out and meet with the golf course superintendent because I was Director of Planning and Operations, and he would give me a problem. Like he says, "I think I've got a fungus problem on this green. What can I do about it?" Well, I didn't have a clue what to do about it. Quite frankly, I was 21 years old, and this guy was a real genius at golf course maintenance. So I said, "I'll tell you tomorrow." You know what I'd do is I'd go back and I'd go to every book that I'd ever hauled along with me, and I'd figure out what he was talking about, and I'd go back the next morning and I'd say, "This is what it is." And he'd say, "You're right." He said, "But what about this?" And so it was a continual learning curve for me. But I never, ever pretended to know something I didn't know. If I didn't know it, I'd say, "I don't know, I'll figure it out." And so I stayed there for a couple of years. It's really interesting. I had designed a couple of little parks on a very small scale when I was there, and I went back 30 years later and those parks were still there. And so it really did make a point to me that what we do as a profession makes a lasting impression on a community, because they hadn't changed the design of those parks in 30 years. I was then recruited to be operations planner, whatever that means, in Minneapolis. And Bob Ruy, one of the people I'll talk about in a few minutes, is one of my real heroes, recruited me but didn't want anybody to know that I was being recruited. There was a highly selective civil service system, And they had to go through a civil service labor union, things to sort of set up this new position. The board was very political. One day I get a call and said, "Hey, guess what? You just placed #1 on the civil service exam." I said, "Oh, that's great. For what job?" And so they finally took me, they finally got serious with me and got me to Minnesota. Put me out again in the same sort of situation in the warehouse where all the maintenance and operations people were, and sort of put me in charge. And again, it was the constant challenge, but the constant challenge of knowing that I could figure it out. I had the educational basis from Texas Tech to figure it out. It's just a matter of researching. It was a constant research job for the first 4 or 5 years there. I think that through that process I earned the respect of the people, of the men, and of the crews and of the labor unions, and became then the director of operations for them, which continued that sort of continued educational spiral for me, where I had to know as much, if not more, than anybody who worked for me, and so it was constantly a degree of education for me. Then was promoted to assistant superintendent. Held that position for 3 years under Bob Ruy, and then Bob Ruy left. I retired, and then I was promoted after a year after that to the superintendent. And I think you talk about one of those aha moments of your life. It's when I woke up one morning. I was 35 years old. I was called by the board president saying, "You're superintendent of the Minneapolis Park System." I was so overwhelmed with the legacy issues that I wasn't sure I was going to be able to do this. I understood I had the skills, and I had the vision, and I had the energy, but did I have the skills to do it? And I think that's again where you recall your resources of the people you know. And I had met a lot of business people in the community at that time, and I'd start talking to them. What's the business plan? What's the game plan? How do I make this work? But most of all, with the Connie Worths and the Theodore Worths and the Charlie Doyles and the Bob Ruys of the system, I couldn't fail. I couldn't let them down. And so I think that was the driving principle behind all of this, is not to let that system down.
Now, of course, from Minneapolis, where did you go from there? Because I know you retired after.
I retired. I had a early window in Minneapolis. I had been superintendent for 18 years. And in any cycle of a city, you understand that there's ups and downs and cycles. And so I'd been through a couple of city cycles of no money, lots of money, no money, lots of money. And so I decided I was going to end the cycle on one of lots of money. So we had spent a lot of money in rebuilding some of the infrastructure of the city. And some of the real leading edge sort of economic developers of how park systems develop cities. But I could see the end of it, and I had a window, and I was almost 54 years old, and I said, I'm going to go try something different. I hadn't decided at that point what I was going to do when I grew up. And it was really good. I wasn't retiring to a front porch because I knew that I was type A, that I had to go somewhere. I had to go do something. So I bought a camper. Actually, I bought a camper off the internet that I had to go to Escondido, California to get.
That's pretty good.
So I got my pickup truck, and my very first pickup truck, and it really felt pretty good. And it took off, felt like West Texas again, took off to Escondido, California, picked up this internet, not yet fixed, you have to build it camper, and started back. And by the way, I said, I should stop by Moab. I've always heard about Moab, Utah as being one of those really phenomenal places in the world. And I was absolutely awestruck with the stratology and the geology and the paleontology and the archaeology, the exhibits, and were Moab. So I walked up to the BLM office and I knocked on the door and I said, hey, I'd like to come out here this winter and volunteer for you. And they said, well, you don't need campground hosts. And I said, that's good, because that's not what I want to do. So I went back to Minnesota, sort of built this camper, and went to Moab, Utah as a volunteer for the BLM the next winter, and had a phenomenal learning experience. Went back to Minnesota, and then it was summer in Minnesota, beautiful times, but then I said, sitting on the porch is not something I like to do. It's not something I want to do. And then I got a call, actually, Richard, from you. He said, have you heard of? And I said, no, but I will check around and see if I know of anybody. And the more I read this thing, the more intrigued I became about this new position in Missouri, with what was then called the Metropolitan Park and Recreation District, was probably one of the largest quality of life issues that I had seen in my entire career, where 3 counties had voted to tax themselves to form a regional system that really spoke to the quality of life in the region. And it was ground floor startup stuff. I mean, it was sort of like, get it young and mold it like you like it. You know all the mistakes of a bureaucracy. Let's build it in a way that makes it efficient with a positive business plan that puts most of the resources at the hands of getting something done rather than at the hands of trying to get it moving. So we did that, and Missouri may be my opus magnus. It may be the one thing that I think I will be most proud of in my life when I finish it.
Well, that's good, because I work with Dave on that project, and I'm glad he came. I actually called him, just being honest, not to hire him, because I figured he was retired, but I figured he knew somebody out there in the profession that could do the job. Well, that's how much I respected him, and I was glad that he did accept the job, and or at least shoot for it, and then of course
yeah, it was an interesting interview process, and it's I think it philosophically takes you to that point in your life when you say, this is something I really want to do. This is not something I have to do.
Right.
It makes the decisions a lot easier.
Just as another point to what you're doing today, and you talked about the 3 counties, but I think it's important to let people know that this district is the size of Rhode Island.
Yeah.
So it's not a small
not
endeavor
a small
that we're getting into, and in particularly, like you said, taking it from the ground floor, particularly with board members and folks who really don't have a clue about what it is that they've gotten into and accepted the job. So let's take back a little bit, and what kinds of things in your education would you say, or what specific things, coursework-wise or whatever, would you say have really been critical to your success in the future as you move through your career?
Well, I think just the core education of parks and what they are. I think that was sort of the construction techniques, the core. But it reminds me of graduating from high school when I was in advanced chemistry. And I went into chemistry class in college, and they covered everything I knew the first day of lecture. So my education in 4.5 or 5 years at Texas Tech was sort of the same way on the first day at the job. Everything that I knew about Parks and Recreation was covered the first day, and I had to learn from that point on. And I learned from people. And I have a list of heroes, if you will, I will call them, that have really steered me through this 40-some years of career. I will obviously start out with my dad, who really taught me the language of the earth, who really said, love it. By the time I was probably 10 years old, I could probably tell you every plant, tree, woody, vine that grew in Texas and Oklahoma. He had such a deep-seated love for that, and every stone and every rock and where it came from, and the interrelationships of all of that. Now, why I went to math in college, I don't know, but aptitude tests and teachers and stuff. So
I was actually going to ask you that, because going from math to science or physics,
right.
and then skipping on, that's a good
and
shift.
So and Urbanowski and his sort of constant talking to me about the ability to understand why something was done. And then my first job in Minneapolis, when Bob Ruy, who was really a hero to me, would take me down to Burger King for eating out, and we'd sit there and he would talk to me about the specifics of what was happening. And one of his phrases is you evaluate the value of parks in terms of its worth to humans. And so I thought about that, and I couldn't quite put that all together. But then again, I was director of operations at that time, so I was trying to teach people how to do things. And one of the things, I'm going to digress for a moment because I think this tells the story, is the maintenance men were absolutely scalping the parks. They were cutting the grass so thin that that they wouldn't grow. The grass wouldn't grow. And that was fine for them because they didn't have to mow it so often. But because Dr. Kitchens at Texas Tech said, you got to keep the grass. So I went and studied, and I figured out the height of the cut of the grass at the time of the season, so I started giving little training sessions to the lawnmower people. It's good for the grass grows better, it has fewer weeds, and it's healthier, and droughts, and I kept through all the agronomic reasons that you do certain things. I'm very proud of myself because I'd studied up on this stuff again. I need to go out the next week and see that they'd lowered their mowers again and they were scalping the grass. Scalping it. And I thought, what in the world am I missing? So I said, okay, now I'm going to go back and remember what Bob Ruy said to me about the value of parks are in terms of their worth to humans. So I went the next day and I said, okay, how many people in this room really know why you cut the grass? One guy says because we're paid to, another guy says because it's a good job, and I says, no, why do we cut the grass? Now, we went through the last week's session about why we cut it at 2 inches, but why do we cut the grass? I said, let me tell you the story. And the story is about this perfectly maintained ball field, infield in the ball field. When it was perfectly cut at 2 inches, the right height, the mat was perfect, the nutrients were perfect, and the kid hit a ball, and the kid at shortstop caught it because he could predict the bounce of that ball because of the conditions of that grass. And you know what? That kid became a better kid because he had more confidence in himself. And that kid became more confident in himself. So he'd go home and he'd tell his family how confident he was. His family became proud of it. The whole community became proud of it because he became a good ball fielder because there was a predictability on that piece of grass. So that's the why you cut the grass.
It's taking it. Well, staying on the theme of heroes. Your dad and Bob Ruy and
Frank Vedic. I think Frank Vedic from Kansas City was probably one of the people who really opened my eyes when I interned for him between my junior and senior year, because there was a man. I had done small landscape projects. I'd done parks and I'd done master plan of a community or something, but I'd never done things of such a landscape scale. Here we were, overlooking on the Victory Memorial, where it is in Kansas City, overlooking parts of Kansas and Missouri that were still undeveloped. And he was buying land that far out because he understood the landscape scale of what a community was being. So that was one of those aha moments to me, is you've got to expand your horizons and expand your thinking.
Okay. In any career, there's one given, and that's change. There is an evolution in us, if you will. But during your professional life, what were the trends or life-influencing things, if you will, that you think affected the profession? And then the spin-off affected courses affected you in terms of your career, and how so?
Well, I don't think we can think of ourselves as a natural resource-based, agricultural, or recreational organization. I think we need to think of ourselves as a business. We're a business in promoting the quality of life. And there's no big one thing in my life that's ever said that. It's always been sort of micro adjustments that this happens to this happens and this happens. And I'll give you an example. When we started rebuilding the Central Riverfront Park in Central Riverfront in Minneapolis, there was no access to the river. The river the city had turned its back on the river. The river was not part of the city anymore. Still had a wonderful park system, but in the H.W.H. Cleveland plan of 1898, it really talked about the great alleys and the great public spaces along the Mississippi River in the St. Anthony Falls. Everybody had ignored that. I found that plan, making some of my research. We went down, and with the help, not particularly a lot of political support, but with a lot of private support, we bought a park right on the Mississippi River, right below St. Anthony Falls, and built access to the river. You know what the interesting thing that happened there was that right behind that park, there was a housing development started. We said, aha, this is something we haven't measured before. So we went upriver a little bit and bought some more parks, and housing developed around that. We went across the river and bought some land and built parks, and housing and commerce moved into that. Finally, at the end of about an 18-year cycle, where we had spent about $80 million worth of park improvements and acquisition, 125 acres of park in downtown is a big park. The city and the county and the state legislature had seen this trend growing and had begun to believe it, and had put about another $200 million into it. So with a public investment of less than $300 million, what you've got now there is a private reinvestment of almost $2 billion, 9,000 jobs. That is the sort of edge of quality of life that we need to deal with as a profession. We can be the leading economic developers of cities by talking about quality of life. The latest governor studies really talk about people moving to areas where they want to live and companies moving to where people want to live for the workforce. So I think that we need to be visionary in the sense that we need to build these great places. And if we understand why we build these great places, then they will come. And we will, and I think that's going to be the change in our profession, is we need to be pro-business model.
Okay. What do you think are the core aspects of the profession in terms of management for Parks and Recreation?
I think that Parks and Recreation, quite frankly, are two separate fields, and I've always felt that.
How so? I mean,
well, recreation is the people aspect of getting people involved in healthy lifestyles and in learning motor skills. Parks, on the other hand, are the facilities that cause that quality of life or that need to happen. In the Maslow theory, you know, your first thing is food, shelter, and then at the bottom you've got to start talking about quality of life. Well, I'd like to reverse that Maslowian thing and put it on the top and say quality of life is what drives everything else. And I think that you can demonstrate that. And I think we need more training and more knowledge about how we can do that as a profession. There are some studies that are starting to come out now that really talk about values in proximity to parks. But that's nothing new. I mean, Frederick Law Olmsted knew that in 1898 when he said an interconnected system of parks and greenways is infinitely more important than isolated systems. We talk about quality of life today. We talk about interconnected and social capital and as great arbiters of the environment. But they knew that all along. We'd just forgotten it for a while. I think we need to revisit that.
I couldn't agree with you more, actually, personally. Mainly, I guess, because I come from outside the field, similar to you did, except you did. But what are the specific principles that you personally abide by in terms of delivering your service to the communities?
I have a knowledge base. I've never wavered from the vision. I know what it is that we need. I know where it is we're going. And I have a degree of integrity that's going to get me there. I do it because I have an honest vision and an honest feel about making that happen. It's hard work. You know, it's hard work. It's not easy. It's not fun and games. They once tried to change the name of the position in Minneapolis to the Superintendent of Fun and Games. I mean, that's how this field can drift if we're not focused and we're not on point about what we're really trying to do.
That's good. What do you think are the keys? Many of us out there in the profession, and I know in working with you now, I'm one of the board members that you work with, but what do you think are the keys to having successful and good, sound relationships with not just board of directors for parks, but commissions, because some folks have commission forms, but also city councils or elected bodies, those type of things. And what would you say are the similarities and the differences? Because they all have an impact on what we do, at least in public recreation.
Well, there's a difference between advisory boards and public policy boards. And I've always worked with public policy boards, never worked with an advisory board. An advisory board, for the most part, to me, often is treated like an auxiliary. It really doesn't have any power. It has only the advice. It's important to keep those relationships on, but when I worked for public policy boards, I always had a Parks Foundation, which was an advisory board. But it wasn't the auxiliary, it was one that was empowered to do something. I think the most important thing when you're working with public policy boards is no surprises. No surprises. No surprises from the administration's point of view, no surprises from the political point of view. Conversation, dialogue, make sure. Now, it's not a love fest. Never ever walk into a room thinking this is going to be somebody who's going to love you. The fundamental rules for public policies is a majority. And you don't even care how the other people vote. You don't know why they vote. You just want if it's your public policy issue, you want the majority. But never walk in there without knowing that you have it either.
Well, speaking of that, since we typically things don't just go like the flow, You know, just because the boss said so, this is where
Right.
we ought to go. And that's part of the role, obviously, of the citizen folks who serve there, because they represent the given segments of the community. But what are strategies that you've used in your career in terms of facing severe opposition, not necessarily just from the board, because it could be from communities within the overall community or segments of the community, or elected officials, for that matter, that seem to take on Parks and Rec as a extra thing, if you will.
See, and that's our fault as a profession. I think the parks suffer way too quietly. You know, police run around and they say, you know, we got to keep the criminals off the street, and the fire department say we got to keep your buildings from burning down. What is the park guy got to fall back on? You know, the parks need mowing. Where are we? We need to have these parks suffer less. They got to suffer more loudly. They got to suffer as loudly as the pothole in the middle of the street. They got to be so integrated within the quality of life psyche of a community as to be a priority. And if we haven't done that, we've failed in our mission. I really think we've failed. If we can't bring the level of park initiatives, the level of park awareness up to that point. Minneapolis, quite frankly, every time they tried to cut a park program, there would be hundreds of protesters at the public policy board meetings. Public policy changes politics, and that's something we need to understand.
It's a good lesson for, I think, everybody who is out there beginning in their career and whatever. But some of us who have been in there a long time sometimes tend to forget those kinds of things because we get caught up in our day-to-day. In view of all of your career challenges, what would you say were the most critical to the success in your field and the things that you've accomplished in Parks and Recreation?
I don't think there's ever a day gone by that I haven't felt challenged by what I do. And I don't know that it's one big thing that's ever caused it. It's a series of things, and I think it's the series of learning from your mistakes or learning from the mistakes of others. I always go back to what my father used to say. He says, you know, learn from the mistakes of others because you don't live long enough to make them all yourself. And so learn from that, learn from your mistakes, and always have the vision, never waver, always be determined on where you're going.
Okay. We've talked a lot about the communities from where you came and some of the specific things that you did, but how would you say that your work impacted the evolution of the community, the communities where you've worked, and specifically in the areas of economics, which we've talked about, social, environments, and the environmental side itself, because you've talked about all three of those things. And how do you think that you've really affected the communities where you've worked?
Well, I think that those, what I call the three tenets, the social capital, the environmental capital, and the economic capital, are the three fundamental service delivery systems that we as a profession constantly have to focus on. We have to evaluate them in terms of worth to humans. We have to evaluate them in terms of how we make those things integrate themselves within the communities in which we work. And I think we always have to keep our eye on those balls. What we do, now those can be those can be leading indicators, or they can be the results of. And I think it's in whichever community you're in. If you buy 500 acres and connect it to another park, three things can happen. It becomes an environmental armature corridor. It can become the corridor for clean air and clean water. It can be more wetlands. It can be more of the things that contribute to the quality of life and health in a community. It also, maybe you do something like build a path between the two. So this social group begins to meet this social group, and it sort of breaks down the lines of division within our community. But what's most important, and what our early forefathers have learned, and which I've learned probably the biggest lessons of all, is that location, location, location is really the rules of real estate. And people want to live next to a positive, growing asset within the community. As a result of property values will increase. Becomes a desirable place to live. There are studies now that are being formed that talk about distance in feet from parks in the declining property values. So those are the net effect. What we try to do as a profession, I think, on the other hand, is try to do those as leading indicators. We know that if we do this, this will happen. So we can bank on it. So I think there's two ways that within a political structure you try to get that accomplished. as a result of what you do, or as an indicator of what you're trying to do as a leader.
Okay. Now I got to ask one of the negative questions in life, but what do you consider to be the worst part of your job? There's a downside to everything, even though the good may overshadow it. What would you say that in the jobs that you've had were the worst things that you had to deal with?
You know, I've never really had any bumps, if you will. There's been a lot of small losses along the way that would affect the decision the next time. But what I think I've been fortunate that those small losses along the way have been learning experiences for me on how to avoid it, what to talk about in relationships, what to talk about in the next time you present a proposal. And I think not always think that you have to be popular. You have to be determined. You have to be focused on what you're trying to do. After all, the board says you're it. You do it. You don't have to go back and ask them, is this the right way to do it? They've already given you the confidence to do it. You just have to have the confidence to pull it off. So it's a series of learning curves. There's a job one time I applied for, didn't get. Probably the best thing that ever happened to me is I didn't get it.
That's Mark Twain's aesthetic distance.
Yeah.
You look back at your life, say that was the worst thing that happened to me, it really was the best.
Right, yeah, it was. And I feel really fortunate in having been superintendent for Minneapolis for as long as I did. Great experience. I am particularly pleased to be in St. Louis as their executive director for the GRGD now. And I think that system, if it continues with the momentum that it's got rolling now for 3 years, will be the premier system in the United States in the future. After all, Minneapolis and Portland and Chicago and Indianapolis have got a 100-year jump on us.
Well, you're getting a good start, I can tell you that. Okay, what would you do, if anything, different in starting way back when in your career and coming all the way up through today?
Oh, I think in some cases I would have been less intense. I think sometimes you have to be intense to get this job done, but I think there are periods of times that I was intense I didn't need to be. I could have been more with the flow. So I think that, you know, if you need a mind transplant to go back and try to, but that's all about learning experiences, you know. And that's all about internships, and I think that's why we ought to have a lot of internships. And interesting, in Minnesota, I had one intern in 30 years. In St. Louis, I have had 3 interns in 3 years. And they're seeking us out. And they didn't in Minnesota, and I don't know why that was. There was a great school there, but they just didn't want to place their internships. And maybe the focus in what I was doing was not within their teaching curricula. I don't know that. Here in St. Louis, or there in St. Louis, it does appear that what we're doing falls within the parameters of the teaching curricula of the public policy research, of the financial, the schools of public policy. So maybe that's what it is.
Well, do you think it's a shift in the education?
I think it's a shift in the profession. I think it's a shift in what we do or how we see ourselves. And we don't see ourselves as a park and recreation district. We really see ourselves as a defining place. And the place that we're trying to define is a place where people want to live, work, and play.
Well, that's what former Senator Jack Danforth said. That's one of his leading criteria of the 2004 effort,
Yeah.
which actually, one of the spin-off things was the
Right.
Great Rivers Greenway District, and that was making St. Louis a better place to live and raise a family. And
I'll tell you
that's part
something
of it.
interesting. I got a call just the other day from a very influential family in St. Louis. Said, you know, we really like this sense of place in Great Rivers Greenway. So, you know, we don't like this Missouri slogan that says, show me state. What we'd really like to say is, we'd like to call ourselves the Great Rivers State. I says, we'd support that.
Yeah, we would. Okay, Dave, let's talk about the future a little bit here. And what trends or life influencing changes do you feel are in the works today? Because we've talked about the profession changing. And along with that, I think these things are going to alter the profession for a long time to come. But what words of advice would you have for the young professional, not necessarily the student, but somebody that's kind of in the middle range in terms of where they need to be thinking and what they need to do in terms of being successes in the future?
Be determined, be knowledgeable, be courageous. And those are words that you say about anything, but I think that maybe has not been the hallmarks of our field in the past. I would have never had a job that I didn't work on a contract. And the contract was a contract that said I didn't have to count votes over what I thought I needed to have every time I walked in there, whether or not I had a job. Is that I'd lose sometimes, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't a threat to my job. And nobody could threaten the way I believed or thought or the direction I set under the threat of not having a job. So be secure in yourself. Learn, learn, learn. Understand the systems. Understand the politics of it. Understand that behind the politicians there's another layer of people who elect the politicians.
Shadow politicians, as we call them.
Know who they are. Know who they are.
Know what makes them tick.
Yeah, know what makes them tick. And take the step outside of the public policy issues. Take the step into the private side on occasion. One of my great mentors in Minnesota was Martin Friedman, who was the director, curator of the Walker Art Center, who together we built, I think, one of the greatest sculpture parks in the world. But he took me to the other side of the realm of a public-private partnership. He showed me how the inner workings of General Mills works and how those people interface and interact with government. So that's the beauty. Learn, be courageous, and don't need the job, want the job.
Okay. What do you see as the vision of the Parks and Recreation? What's the future? Is it going to expand? Is it going to diminish?
I think
is it going to shift directions, maybe even?
I think you constantly have to shift directions. This isn't about, and I spoke earlier, and I probably have angered a few of my colleagues about, I don't think Parks and Recreation are the same thing. You know, one's an adjective and one's a verb, and they aren't the same thing. Recreation is an activity. Parks are a thing. They're a philosophy. They're a state of mind. And it's how we move that state of mind into quality of life in American cities.
Okay. Now, what one single piece of advice would you give to a graduating student who really doesn't know anything about the profession except their internship? That's pretty much what they've been taught in class.
Just open mind. Learn. Determine early where you want to go. Roll with the punches. It's really important that you understand where you want to as an individual, and this is individualism, where you as an individual want to take a community. That's important.
Okay. Dave, now we're going to go back to you. And in closing out this interview and this introduction about what you are and what you are, where are you going? What's your future?
One of the things, Richard, and I think that I've talked to you a little bit about this, that I have in my 40 years seen is I drive by in the car or walk down the pathways, volunteers digging in flower beds or hauling off trash or holding community forums or holding rallies or bake sales to get playground equipment. I am so intrigued with the amount of energy that those folks have put together to make themselves feel good that I'm going to, when I finally quit, I'm going to go do the same thing. I'm going to repay all of those people who worked under my systems in the past years. I'm going to go volunteer. I'm going to, every time I pick up a piece of paper or clean a toilet, which I've never done as a park professional before, but I may as a volunteer, because the volunteers did that for us, is I'm going to think about all those thousands and thousands of people. So we used to calculate the amount of, if we just paid volunteers a minimum wage, what it would be on an annual basis, and it sometimes would go into the hundreds of thousands of dollars that a community otherwise wouldn't have had. So I'm going to give that back.
Well, thank you, Dave, for all you do. Not just what you've done, but everything you've done in the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you.